Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang, and we're going to dive into a interesting and touchy and difficult subject today. We're going to dive into gun violence and gun control, and not so much from a standpoint of what is the Christian position on gun violence, well, against, or what is the Christian position on gun control, but more from a standpoint of how do we approach the conversation? What's the we talk a lot and we have talked a lot in this podcast that politics has a how component and a what component. How do you approach conversations about the most difficult issues? In what way do you communicate about those issues? And then without divorcing it from the what. I mean, politics is about a what. What should the policy be? What should the outcome be? Even as you're thinking very hard about how should I live within politics in the political world, you're also thinking very hard about what should be the outcome of the political world. And we talk a lot about Micah 6:8 in this format of act justly, which is not optional. We're trying to seek a just outcome, but also two other components that are not optional as well: loving kindness and walking humbly. So, Curtis, I can think of few topics better suited to put this framework to the test than our nation's argument about gun violence and gun control.
Yeah, it is about as divisive as anything else. I mean, it is probably replaced, I think, at this point, at least in this cultural moment, replaced abortion as the issue that is galvanizing fear and hate on both sides.
Yeah.
And antipathy, and in the sense of the other side is incomprehensible to your side. So this is a great test for the how being as necessary as the what of politics. And I have to just say, I think I'm going to have to major on trying to think about the how, because on the what, it is a complex issue. It's not one that I think I'm a particular expert on. When we first talked about like wanting to do guns, I was sort of hoping like, can we do like Top Gun? Can we talk about that? That feels like a lot
well, we can talk about Top. I'm happy to talk about.
You're
Top
happy
Gun,
to. Well, maybe we'll just pivot here.
Yeah.
Avoid controversial topics. And talk about Top Gun. But no, I do think we have to. I think we have to at least try and explore and maybe a model here. Sort of how do you talk about this? And one of the things that we've talked about in the past is that the conversation, both in politics and in personal relationships, goes off the rails very quickly if you immediately adopt a us versus them framework with a them
right.
is out to get us, right? And at least one way to moderate the us versus them instinct that is so strong is to actually understand the human story that of the other person that holds a different view. And I think it's probably helpful even for our conversation, even if it's, we may not end up completely on polar opposites. I imagine we're going to be, on the what, on different, potentially different sides of this, that it's probably helpful to start with what's our story? What's our story with guns in particular? Because, the research shows that where you stand, or where you end up on gun control is significantly determined by your own life history, including from a very early age or childhood. It's like, what did you grow up with guns? Did you grow up shooting guns? Did your parents have guns? Ends up being a pretty strong predictor of where you are on guns. Mm-hmm. So I almost feel like a helpful first step, if you're going to talk about guns, is just to declare, hey, what's my own personal narrative relative to guns? What's my relationship to guns like? So I could start, and then I'd actually like to hear yours, because I think we're going to have two different stories here.
We might.
So I grew up in an immigrant culture. It is not a gun culture. The whole, the instrument that would have been held up as something close to a revered object to be passed down from one generation to another was not guns. It was like musical instruments. We were if anything, piano and violins. Like, don't touch my violin and pianos would have been the thing that would have been the protected instrument that we would have wanted to uphold in our culture. And I don't know if there was never any regulation against concealed carries of violins and violas, but if there was, I think my community would have rallied against that. And so, we were just guns were just not in our lives. Now, personally, I was fascinated with guns, but that was in a military context. As what David, you and I do share is we're both military history buffs. And so I loved to study guns. I can tell you why the MG42 was the superior infantry squad weapon of choice in World War II. But what's foreign is when that weapon got inserted into the household, into one's own sort of personal lives or family life. That was bizarre to me. I just never experienced that. I don't think I knew a single family growing up in the Chinese American community that owned guns. Didn't know anybody that went hunting. So even to this day, I don't own a gun. The closest thing I have to a weapon in my house is David, is my compound hunting bow. And I don't even hunt like living beings with it. The closest thing is I shoot at is a styrofoam deer on my target at the target range I go to. So I don't actually think I have fired a live gun yet, which probably puts
really
me in,
in your whole life.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Wow.
I can't remember. Not of anything of high caliber, anyways. Maybe ear guns and that sort of thing. I think the closest thing I came to heavy carrying like an assault, something close to a machine gun or assault weapon, was actually at the Fantasy Baseball League draft that you hosted, David, where you took us out to the simulation sort of
range.
Range where we all were outfitted with like heavy tactical weapons and thrown into various virtual simulations with guns that were equipped to shoot with pneumatic pressure what it was like. And I was like, oh, I think this is the first time I've ever fired a semi-automatic or automatic weapon. I can't even remember firing a handgun. So this is, I know this is why for me I am so inclined towards strong gun control laws. I have intellectual reasons for it, but I also have I don't feel like it touches. I don't lose anything by advocating for that. And the other side that so values having sort of easier access to guns and gun ownership, it's incomprehensible to me. It's outside my range of experience, and so I know that shapes how I think and feel about guns. And actually, probably, David, my friendship with you has been my closest access to the world of gun ownership. And so I'm super interested to hear your story, David, and especially tell your story, David, with an eye towards me, and like, what do people like me, or who are lean towards people like me in terms of background, what do people like me really need to know and understand about gun culture and its place in your lives?
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to think I knew what I meant when I said gun culture, but I think we have to parse that out more, and I'll do that when I tell my story. I grew up, and I don't remember a time when we didn't have a gun in the house. I shot a gun for the first time. I was so young, I don't remember when that was. So I was young enough. I remember shooting a 22. I remember it was a 22, which is sort of like if you grow up where I grew up, that's your first gun that you shoot is a 22 because it's got very, very low recoil. And I remember shooting a 22. I literally don't remember when that was. It was young elementary school. Wow. So
with your dad?
So no, a friend. I went out with a friend. And that was no big deal. Like, you're going out with a friend and you're going to shoot guns. No big deal, right? And so there's never a time that I can remember where we didn't have a gun in the house. I don't remember the time before I have memories of being a kindergartner, first grader or whatever, but from the point where you're sort of more fully formed as a person, I don't remember a time where I didn't shoot guns. And my entire adult life, I've had a gun, at least one gun in the home for self-defense. And I'm not a hunter. I've never really gotten into hunting. I don't enjoy it that much. And so I'm not a hunter. I've owned guns because I enjoy target shooting. So I have some guns that we use for target shooting. My son got into trap and skeet. So we have some shotguns that were in trap and skeet. And by the way, listeners, if you have a kid who says, I would really like shooting sports, two things about that. One, they're a ton of fun. And the whole sort of like when you go to an event, there's a really great spirit about it. It's a lot of fun. But number two, it's so expensive. Like if your kid is like, maybe I'll try it, watch your checkbook, because my goodness, that's expensive. But let's put that aside for a minute.
Wait, David, hold on.
Anyway.
I want to ask. So, in your early memories of shooting a gun, what was your early memory of what it felt like? What was the feeling?
It was fun. Target shooting is fun. Like it's kind of tough to explain if you've never done it before, but if you put up a line of like apples or Coke cans or whatever, it's fun. It's a challenge. It's fun. Yep. So I don't remember because it was so demystified. I mean, it was never at any point was it like you were taught from the beginning that you treat a gun with caution, extreme caution. So you're taught all of the rules, but once you're taught the rules and you understand the rules and how how to be safe, it's demystified. And so you never had this sense of, it was more like, okay, what are the rules? Here are the rules. I'm being closely supervised. Here's what we're going to do. You're shown you're taught how to handle it. And that, and especially when you're younger, you don't really have this sort of sense of this is something that is a subject of contention or controversy. Mm-hmm. It's more like this is what you do. This is what you learn when you're growing up. And so that's where I always was. It was what I did. It was just what I learned. And I didn't shoot a bunch when I was growing up, just a moderate amount. But then, I had a gun for self-defense my entire adult life. And Nancy, our special guest last week, also grew up completely around guns. She shot guns when she was younger. She would go deer hunting with her dad. So we both grew up in that environment where owning a gun, I don't think she has a memory of a household that didn't have a gun. And so, but that's what I would recall gun culture, in the extent that you are used to being around guns, you understand guns, you know the rules of dealing with guns, you purchase guns for specific purposes, whether it's target shooting or hunting or self-defense, and you just know them. Then there's something else that's happened in more recent years that I call gun fetish. And this is something that if you see like a Christmas card from a congressman, and every single member of the family has an assault weapon, so-called assault weapon of some sort, or Congresswoman Lauren Boebert and how she has crossed AR-15s behind her when she talks, and how it seems to be almost mandatory for a Republican politician in some parts of the country to pose with an AR-15. That's what I call gun fetish culture, and that is alien to me, because the issue with guns was not that they had special meaning, in other words, an elevated meaning. Yeah. It's that they were sort of a normal part of life, and they were a normal part of life, not a central part of life. And I think that that's the difference between gun culture, these guns are a normal part of life, versus gun fetish, which these guns are a central part of life. And I think especially in recent years, you've seen a lot more of the gun fetish world emerge, that I am defined by guns. You see this, like Josh Mandel. What was his? He finished second in the Ohio Senate primary, and his tagline for his race was "Pro God, pro gun, pro Trump." Right. That's gun fetish. There was this fringe Georgia candidate who gubernatorial candidate. I believe hers was God, baby, and God, guns, and babies.
Right.
That was her. So you see that is alien to me. That gun fetish world is alien to me. You had a much more sort of detached view of them as an instrument, as a tool, not as a marker of identity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how did we get there? How did we get from guns as an instrument, normalized instrument in life, to gun fetish as an object of identity and almost worship and exaltation? You're closest to that culture, where that has happened the most. What are why did this happen?
I would put it as at the feet of the negative cultural effects of negative partisanship. So let's remember what negative partisanship is. Negative partisanship is I support the Republican Party not because I love Republican points of view, but because I might hate or fear Democrats, or I support the Democratic Party not because I love the Democratic platform, but because I hate or fear Republicans. And so what has ended up happening is this culture that you've really seen come up in the last 3, 4, 5 years of what you'd call owning the libs. In other words, intentionally provocative conduct designed to create a negative emotional response. I think the Daily Wire sells a liberal tears tumbler, hot and cold liberal tears. And so this whole mindset is taking on a life of its own, which is I'm going to display open defiance, and I'm going to be as openly defiant as possible of the values and mores of my political opponents. So the more I can be defiant of them, the more sort of emotional response I can get from them, the more successful that I am. And you see this pattern repeated across all kinds of categories of discourse, So if moving for a moment from gun rights, especially online, you will see people who Twitter accounts or, social media accounts of prominent Republicans that are very disproportionately focused on the trans issue, but not in a way that's attempting to be persuasive, but in a way that's attempting to sort of mock and trigger and inflame, because the goal here, that's the whole goal, is to create a reaction. And hopefully in creating a reaction, sort of make the other side look unreasonable. But, forgetting the fact that the actions you're taking to create the reaction are often unreasonable all in and of themselves. So that's, I think, the root of the gun fetish movement. And there's always been, collectors and things like that. I'm not talking about that. But sort of this gun fetish, open defiance, I'm going to carry where I want to carry, and I don't care how it makes you feel. A lot of that's rooted in negative partisanship.
And how much, David, where does it break down in the South, in a typical community like in Tennessee, folks who are in the gun fetish camp versus people who simply are in the kind of guns are part of our culture camp? What's the breakdown?
The vast majority. So I would put it almost every political phenomenon tends to break down in the same way, which is you're going to have a minority of people who exercise a disproportionate public presence because they're super dedicated to the issue. So they're going to fill the void. Whereas you have a majority of people who, when push comes to shove, they might be opposed to X or Y gun control measure, but it's not a central part of their lives. So they're not asserting themselves into the public square to say, no, this gun fetishism doesn't stand for us. They're just not talking about it. They have a gun or they have two or whatever, and maybe they even conceal carry a gun, but they just don't talk about it. So what ends up happening is it creates this vacuum, as it is on. You can just name the issue. There's a vacuum of people that is immediately filled with the people who really care. So when you have that, it often begins to feel like, well, everyone in Tennessee is like in love with an AR-15, When the fact of the matter is, it's only a small fraction of people who even possess those kinds of weapons who are out there putting them in front of everybody and, aggressive about it.
Well, it explains the puzzling, fact of American politics, where you actually have a majority of Americans, including most Republicans, who favor things like background check, red flag laws, restrictions on assault weapons, and yet those things seem to be politically infeasible. And it sounds like you're saying because the politics of it is so, at this point, so overly dominated by the gun fetish far extreme that they've shaped the terms such that, in the binary of between guns or not guns, the gun, if like, no, I want guns to still be part of my life, it means adopting whole hog the full extreme of that version of that viewpoint.
Yeah, I think be careful with issue polling around guns, because what's interesting is the actual real world voting results often do not mirror issue polling at all. So I'll give you the New York Times actually today, we're recording this on a Friday, today has this really interesting analysis of the difference between issue polling results on things like background checks and actual votes. So what's interesting is in California, for example, in 2016, there was a referendum on background checks, and the expected support based on issue polling was 91%. The actual support was 63%, still a solid majority, but this is California. Maine had a background check issue poll expected support of 83%, but the actual support was 48%. For example, going back to 2016, it says Hillary Clinton fared better at the ballot box than expanded background checks in the same states, most on the same day, among the same voters. So I have, if you listen to advisory opinions, you'll know that Sarah and I often rail against issue polling, because what often it does is it measures sentiment in the abstract, but it doesn't measure concretely, nor does it measure priority. And so what you consistently find is amongst voters who place, and this is true on life issues, this is true on judges, this is true on guns, amongst voters who place a priority on the issue, there tend to be more, voters tend to be more supportive of gun rights. They tend to be more pro-life. They tend to be more focused on judges amongst people who put a priority on those issues. And it's the people who put a priority who decide it. Like right. It's the people who emphasize it that decide almost any issue in American life.
So how come, David, I mean, it sounds like you're saying there is a block of folks in what we might call gun culture who believes that, it's okay, it's normal to have guns in households. You think there's a block of people there who are not gun fetishes, who wouldn't view any, would you say those people would be open at least to some forms of gun control, or would they say, no, look, you don't even touch the sacred object?
They're going to be open to some forms, but they're not going to be the same forms of gun control that, say, somebody who comes from San Jose, so to speak. There and so that's what the kind of gun reform that people who come from a gun rights culture are most open to is gun reform aimed at behavior of people, not at the gun itself. Okay, so that's why you have broad support for prohibitions on felons in possession, which is a prohibition not on the gun, it's a prohibition on the person who has, as evidenced by their behavior, disqualified themselves from ownership. It's why you have high degree of support for restrictions on people who've been adjudicated to be dangerously mentally ill. It's not the gun, it's the person. It's why there's broad support for prosecuting straw purchases. A straw purchase is where you buy a gun for somebody who's not qualified to own one, or who's not legally able to own one. And you buy it, you lie on your report, your form, the federal form that you fill out when you purchase a gun. You lie about who it's for. You give it to somebody who is not qualified or is not legally able to possess. High degree of support for that form of gun control. Again, behavior based. There's a lot of curiosity and amongst a lot of people on the right about red flag laws because they're behavior based. In other words, if you have engaged in behavior that indicates you might be a threat to yourself or others, then should you have weapons? National Review just this week editorialized and said that it was open to red flag laws. Marco Rubio and Rick Scott have submitted legislation last year for red flag laws. Doug Ducey, governor of Arizona, all these are Republicans, right? Mm-hmm. Has indicated support for what he calls severe threat orders of protection, a form of a red flag law. And that is, I think, that's the kind of gun control that you are, that's the kind of gun control that you tend to see people who come from a gun rights culture being open to. It's behavior based.
And what do you think about that? Because it does seem like, well, let me throw out one demographic in which behavior-based sort of gun control doesn't really address, which is children and teenagers. And you know, right now, guns, according to all the sort of studies from public health, is the number one leading killer of children between 0 and 19, more than anything else. It is guns that actually kill children, and accidental discharge is a significant public health problem. And so that would argue for, look, the guns themselves, not just the behavior, because these are children who, you know, you're not, the various regulations you're talking about aren't going to address their behavior, especially around accidental behavior, especially around suicides also, right? Mm-hmm. And so what's the argument for against people who are saying, look, okay, behavior is one thing, but the widespread availability of this weapon itself is a problem?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, that stat I think is misleading because it includes 18 and 19-year-olds, which are prime ages for criminal gun violence, and our 18 and 19-year-olds are not typically considered children. So I saw that stat flying around, and I was like, really? And then you dig in and you realize it's 18 and 19-year-olds are included. Once you exclude 18 and 19-year-olds, that changes dramatically. But on the issue of children and accidental gun deaths, there is a behavior-based reform that, in fact, is one of the only ones to show real promise in decreasing unintentional injuries and deaths, and those are child access or safe storage laws. So, in other words, the issue is, what do you have safe storage in your house? And so, laws, again, those are laws that are related to behavior. What are you doing with these guns? Are they locked away? Do you have a safe? And so child access laws have an actual measurable effect, according to Rand Corporation studies, on both unintentional injuries and deaths and suicide. And so that's one of the few, by the way, gun control measures that does have a pretty strong relationship with the challenge it's designed to address. In other words, if you look at various rigorous studies, you'll see that child access prevention laws do actually make a difference for suicide and unintentional deaths. But again, that's a behavior-based sort of reform that an awful lot of people are going to get on board with, even if they are broadly supportive of gun rights.
And so what are the political prospects right now of behavioral-based gun control if the access you feel like is a dead end politically?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's super complicated, because here's what tends to happen. What tends to happen is you'll have a terrible event occur, and there will be there are two sides to the debate. One immediately tends to go into any sort of debate about gun violence with a sort of what you would call sort of the standard menu of policy proposals: background checks, assault weapons bans, magazine capacity bans. That's sort of the standard menu. And then you have the right will say no to that. And then you don't really get to stuff that's outside of the standard menu. And so that's why one of the reasons why I've been jumping up and down yelling about red flag laws, because they're relatively new. I believe the first one was actually passed in perhaps 2005. I could be wrong about that, but they've only become a popular thing to talk about, or relatively popular, in the last 4 years. So it's relatively new. So it's not part of the standard menu. So I'm up there jumping up and down talking about this relatively new thing. But we always end up, it's always Groundhog Day on the actual policy proposals, and some of the other stuff that's been deemed to be pretty darn effective often just isn't part of the conversation, because it's not the thing that really gets people motivated on either the right or the left.
You're talking about the red flag laws.
I was talking about child access and prevention.
Oh, child access, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not part of the conversation because it's kind of not part of the standard menu of policy responses. Because again, when something terrible happens, you're not necessarily dealing with a huge body of lawmakers who are really expert in all of this stuff. I would bet how many of them have even looked at the Rand Corporation's website that's sort of this big study of studies of gun control? 1%? I mean, so they go with the standard stuff, I'm a Democrat. I'm for X, Y, and Z. I'm a Republican. I'm against X, Y, and Z. And it's hard for the other out-of-the-box kind of things to sneak in.
So let's talk a little bit. I mean, the policy debates feel stalemated, and even the studies. It's one thing I was looking at in preparing for this was just also how actually few studies there are on things like efficacy of various gun control laws. I think that was part of the point of that Rand control. The Rand Corp study was just that a lot of these studies are poorly designed, have various flaws to them, and there seems to be even just a need for better understanding at a public policy level for, hey, what works and what doesn't. So that's a whole complex set of issues. I want to shift the gear towards, though, back to the how, in that if this is an issue that we are stuck in because we just don't even know how to talk about it, what could be the distinctive contributions Christians can make to this conversation?
That's a really good question. I think there's a couple of ways that we can make a contribution. Values and approach. So what are the values with which you're approaching this? What are some of the underlying values here with which you're approaching the debate? Protection of innocent life, for example, is a very high value. That is a very pro-life value. That is a value that's all through Scripture. Protection of innocent life is a high value. And then at the same time, also, if we're walking in to this debate humbly as we should, a recognition of complexity. So we need to be recognizing complexity. We need to put a high value on innocent life. We should be extraordinarily open to information or arguments that might contradict our pre-existing biases. A person who grew up without guns, who doesn't understand guns at all, should be quite open to hear from somebody, for example, and this is something I wrote for The Atlantic, and I'll just read you. It's not been edited yet, but here's I wish the gun debate included more voices of people who have faced threats to their lives without the wealth and resources to employ armed security guards. So we need to be open to hearing a wide variety of voices in the debate, against filtering them through a sort of a background understanding of what a high value we're going to place on human life throughout this entire process. And so yeah, so I think that's an incredibly important way to approach it. But this is also something that is not easily. This is an issue that is not easily susceptible to an argument that this, Curtis, is the Christian position on the issues. And you can understand why when we start to peel back some of the complexities here as to why that might be, because a lot of the sort of shorthand sloganeering that you hear turns out to be just really wrong. And a lot of what we feel like in our bones has to be right isn't necessarily right. And so that's what makes this a really tough kind of debate to have, where it gets really difficult to pull down to the first order. Okay, just Curtis and David, cut to the chase. What's the Christian position here?
Right. Well,
I don't know. I've got my position. I'm not ever going to say it is, and it's based on my Christian values, but I'm never going to say this is the Christian position.
Right. But let's play that out for a moment. Like, I think my instinctive, I totally agree with you in terms of the complexity of this issue, the need to recognize that complexity, and I think the need to listen to the other that you're going to tend to view as incomprehensible. And again, I found that to be helpful. There still is in me this instinctive reaction that's like, look, why do we need assault weapons in this world? Why do private citizens need to have access? Why can't we just ban assault weapons, high capacity, cartridges? It serves no purpose. There's other ways to protect innocent lives other than giving people access to these weapons. Start with that just simple policy proposal. Why? What greater complexity do I need to grasp from believing that that's a common sense and like a biblically mandated or biblically encouraged, at least, position to protect innocent lives, to put the priority on protecting innocent lives?
Well, one of the things we have to do is we have to cut through some language here. So the phrase assault weapons is inherently loaded to begin with. Mm-hmm. We don't, if you're going to say, are weapons of war, in other words, like the weapon I carried in Iraq, is that available on the marketplace? No, it is not. Okay. Now, I possess a version of what I carried in Iraq, but it is not what I carried in Iraq. It has no capacity for fully automatic gunfire. So what I carried in Iraq had 3 settings: safe, single shot, in other words, semi-auto, safe, semi, and burst. So I could, on the gun I carried in Iraq, it could fire 3-round bursts, and as well as semi-automatic. And semi-automatic, for people who don't know, is firing every time you pull the trigger. Well, firing every time you pull the trigger is the single most common way that rifles are designed. It's the single most common way that handguns are designed. So when you talk about assault weapon, what are you talking about? Well, you're usually talking about a rifle that works the way all other rifles work, but looks military style and has a detachable magazine. Okay. Now, well, that's, again, the way most rifles are, is they have a detachable magazine. So then you say, well, what about the magazine size? Okay, got it. Well, when we talk about as large capacity magazines, we're often talking about what are actually, another phrase to use is standard capacity, the normal size magazine that comes with a weapon of that type. And the Supreme Court has an interesting way of phrasing the nature of weapons that are encompassed by the Second Amendment. And it's guns in common use for a lawful purpose. Okay? You don't get more common than the AR-15. Or it's hard to find. It's the most common rifle in circulation in the United States, period. The estimate is around 20 million of them in circulation. And so, what rifles do is they actually kill fewer people per year in gun deaths than fists. More people are beaten to death than are killed by rifles in the U.S., murdered by rifles. So it's not commonly used for criminal purposes. It's extremely commonly used for lawful purposes. Same with semi-automatic handguns. And so what value does here exist? What is the underlying value that, say, for example, the Second Amendment exists to protect? And the underlying value is the right of self-defense and the defense of others. That's the underlying value. And the way I've put it to people is that value is only protected if it's protected in a meaningful way. And the way I've put it is against foreseeable threats. And it's no secret my family has been under threat off and on for 7 solid years. And if I think about what is the threat that I will face, what is the threat that I will face? It is a threat of a gun that's in common use. What are the guns that are in common use? They're semi-automatic firearms. That's the gun that's in common use. And so I think anytime you're talking about restricting a gun that's in common use for a lawful purpose, what you're talking about is restricting for law-abiding people the weapon, a weapon that would be the equivalent of what they will almost certainly face if they ever face a threat to their lives. And so I'm fully on board with banning or sharply limiting weapons that are of not common use for lawful purposes. So very large capacity magazines like were used in the Aurora mass shooting, or fully automatic weapons, or things like that. They're not in common use for a lawful purpose. They should be heavily, heavily regulated. But if a gun is in a common use for a lawful purpose, then the problem that you have is if you restrict it for the law-abiding, you're not doing really anything to restrict it for the criminal class, because what we know is they don't obtain their guns lawfully. Mass shooters are a separate category. We can deal with that. But people who use guns to commit violent crime are obtaining weapons unlawfully, overwhelmingly. And so the restrictions on lawful purchase don't necessarily implicate what you're going to face with a criminal. And then if you look at the Rand study of studies, there's not a lot of evidence that these kinds of things make a difference to the underlying challenge they're trying to address.
But David, I hear what you're saying there. It strikes me that it feels a little bit like you're saying, look, because there's a lot of guns out there that could do a lot of damage, I need to have a lot of guns out there that could do an equivalent level of damage. And we're back to the level of, well, okay, if there's a lot of guns out there, then we need to arm people with a lot of guns of a certain caliber and type and function and so forth. But doesn't this put the conversation back to, well, why don't we just try to get less guns out there? Like, actually, you can't get around the fact that, just focusing on behavior and not trying to limit the availability of guns, that has to be considered as part of the solution, because even why you're saying why you might need a gun is because there's a lot of other guns in circulation. So shouldn't we be attacking this both from behavior and both from availability? That's
not precisely. So, for example, it's not just a lot of guns. It's that criminals have guns. Okay. That's not exactly the same thing. So, for example, if you look at murder rates around the world, there are many countries in the world with much higher murder rates than ours. Mm-hmm. And every last one of them has much lower gun ownership rates, much lower. So if you look across Latin America, which has tons of countries across Latin America have much higher murder rates than the United States, every one of them has way lower gun ownership rates. So it isn't just sort of this one-to-one thing that says more guns equals more crime. It is much more of how do criminals behave is a really big part of the equation. And so it isn't just, that's one of the things that I think gets really lost in a lot of this, is we sort of say, well, we're awash in firearms and that's why we're awash in gun violence, or we're awash in firearms and that's why we have high suicide rates, when you can go across the world and find nation after nation after nation with much lower gun ownership rates and much higher and higher rates of violent crime and higher rates of suicide. Russia, for example, has very low private gun ownership rates, has very high homicide rates, it has very high suicide rates. South Korea has microscopic gun ownership, but very high suicide. And so a lot of the issue here isn't so much, well, it's just like math. The more guns you have in the population, the more crime you have. A lot of it's about behavior of, behavior of and means and methods and use by the criminal class in society. And it's not necessarily tied to percentage of gun ownership, like how many people have guns. Even if you break it down in American demographics, it is not the case that the demographic of Americans who owns the most guns commits the most crime. That's not the way it works at all. And so that's why it gets really, and again, that's why if you're going to look at these studies of, for example, the efficacy of restrictions on guns themselves, the evidence is non-existent with mass shootings and very iffy on violent crime overall as to the efficacy of any given gun regulation. It's because it's aimed at something that isn't necessarily the actual problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it seems like what you were saying is the best argument for limited sort of gun control, or limiting the kind of gun control efforts and making at least guns available in some meaningful way is self-defense. So speak a little bit to how much are guns actually used in self-defense? Because the studies I'm saying, and there's some debate on this topic.
Huge
like
debate.
How do you measure? Huge debate. How do you measure? Right. So on the one end, you've got something from Harvard Injury Control Research Center saying only 1% of people who are crime victims claim to have used a gun to protect themselves. I think from the you're going to find a larger number from the pro-gun voice. Can you help us parse through, just in reality, how much is guns actually used to protect innocent lives in self-defense?
The short answer is it's actually impossible to know. And I'll explain to you why it's impossible to know. Yeah. The reason why it's impossible, now you can measure things like justifiable homicides. In other words, when somebody is actually shot and killed in self-defense, or you can, or shot and wounded, you can actually track that somebody is injured or hurt or injured or killed in a shooting, and then there's an adjudication process that determines whether or not that's justifiable homicide. We can know that, and that's a really low number. What you cannot possibly know is the most common use of a gun in self-defense is not firing it at all, it's brandishing it. It's the knowledge that somebody has a gun, by display or otherwise, that deters an individual from engaging in criminal activity. So that's a number. You can do surveys and you can try to extrapolate, but it's very difficult to know. So we know the number is much larger than the number of justifiable homicides, but there's also a number that you don't have any idea. So when we got under threat, when the first time we got under threat, we did something. We put out on social media that Nancy had received some advanced training in handgun use. We put out on social media that we have certain kinds of guns. And we did that very intentionally because we wanted people who were threatening us via social media to know that we were not a soft target. Now, does that count as a defensive gun use? Not by any normal standard of what that would count as a defensive gun use. Did that have any effect at deterring anybody? Maybe. I don't know. How would you possibly measure that? So there's a huge argument over this. On the one hand, people are saying, well, if you go by brandishing or knowledge, just a gun is a deterrent analysis of defensive gun use. It might be hundreds of thousands of times per year. If you go by the time when a gun was actually fired in anger against an intruder or somebody who's attacking you, then the number diminishes dramatically. And that's part of the reason for The argument is you have people operating in two different information universes. On the gun rights side, they're going to say, wait a minute, hundreds of thousands of times per year, guns are used in some way to deter crime. And then on the gun control side, they'll say, well, I'm looking at the justifiable homicide stats, and it's incredibly low. So what are you talking about? You're paranoid. You're not going to use this gun to defend yourself. The odds of you using this gun to defend yourself are microscopic. So the answer is we don't know. That's a long way of saying we don't know.
And I'm guessing that many listeners are, or at least some listeners are in that mode of like, well, what do you know? What can you tell us ought to be the answer here? And probably you might be listening to the last 45 minutes feeling like, oh, you're making my head hurt with all this complexity of this issue. And that's kind of the point here. We're saying is that part of when we're in these polarized situations and environments, that in a strange way, complexity actually is your friend. I mean, as a Christian, is your friend, because it does force you to actually slow down and actually check your immediate reactions. You may end up in a different place. I don't, you guys are all hearing conversations I've had, variants of conversations, of snippets of conversations I've had with David in the past. He hasn't really actually changed my mind fundamentally. I'm still pretty pro gun control, and I think we need more of it, and I think access to it really matters. But everything that David's saying actually causes me to like, well, okay, this is not a simplistic us versus them. Us is right, them is automatically wrong. And we're trying to replicate something of that experience for our listeners, as potentially frustrating as it may be for people who just want to be right.
It's incredibly frustrating. So this is I wrote this piece for The Atlantic. It's going to go up later today, called "The Reality of Mass Shootings is More Depressing Than You Think," which is a bold claim because it's pretty depressing, but it's more depressing than you think. And we often operate with one scenario that we approach the debate when the other scenario is true. Here's the first scenario that we operate in when we approach a lot of public policy problems, complicated ones, including this one. In the first scenario, we know there's a crisis. We know there's a solution to the crisis, yet we lack the political will to solve it, or we might have the will, but we're constantly blocked by the bad people who don't want to solve the problem. That's an enraging perspective, right? Here we have a crisis. We know what to do to stop the crisis, and you're stopping me from stopping the crisis. That is enraging to people. And if that was the truth, there'd be a lot of reason to be enraged. But it's not the truth. The truth is, and this is the argument that I make, we don't know how to solve the mass shooting problem. We don't know how to even make it better. We have some good faith ideas about how to make it better, but we don't have sufficient evidence that even these good faith ideas will work. And when you approach it from that second perspective, does that mean you don't have a policy position? Not at all. Of course you have a policy position. You have a crisis. You want to be creative in trying to figure out how to address it. You just can't leave it there, right? And just throw your hands up and say, well, I guess people have to die in mass shootings. No, you don't do that at all. But do you walk in and say, you, Curtis, because you want some enhanced gun control, are completely standing in the way of my plan, which I know will work, which is arming teachers in single entry point, which is not my plan, but let's just presume it
Let's hope not, David.
Yeah, but I'm just saying this is the way these things go. Well, my plan is arming teachers in single point of entry, and your plan is something I know won't work, and you're blocking saving kids' lives. See how different that is than a approach that's based on sort of the reality. So anyway.
Well, let's each give ourselves one last turn at the soapbox here, David. You have written publicly, like, look, here's what I think we ought to do. Again, realizing that it is not going to solve everything. There is no one panacea here. But you have said, even in multiple times, even in this podcast, that you really believe a starting point that can command potentially some broader consensus across the ideological spectrum are red flag laws. And producer Chris has put in a note here saying, hey, explain more clearly what red flag laws are. So your last turn of the soapbox, make the case. First, explain what red flag laws are and make the case why at least it's a helpful starting point for anyone, including Christians, who want to actually try to make a difference on this issue.
Yeah, so here's the short version of why I'm in favor of red flag laws. And for those who don't know what a red flag law is, it's very simple. It is a policy that allows you to petition a court for an order seizing the guns from somebody who has demonstrated that they are potentially harmful to themselves or others. So the reason is pretty simple. We now sadly have 50 years of experience with mass shootings in the United States. The National Institute for Justice funded a study of every mass shooting for 50 years, and found that in a majority of mass shootings, the shooter leaked their plans before the shooting. So they used a variety of weapons. Most mass shootings are not with assault weapons. Most mass shooters obtain their weapons legally. So they went through background checks and all of this. The ones who didn't obtain it legally, they often stole it from friends or family. But what we found is in the majority of cases, they leaked their plans. Now, also, we know this. We know that mass shooters tend to be, and Malcolm Gladwell laid this out brilliantly in 2015 in an article for The New Yorker. Mass shooters tend to follow a script. Why do they follow a script? Because they're engaged in mimicking behavior, imitative behavior. One of the reasons why we have so many is actually going all the way back to the hold that Columbine shooters have on the community of disaffected, alienated young men who often become mass shooters. And there's a script, and that script includes leaking of plans. It includes broadcasting your menace and your radiating your menacing intentions. And so you have the combination of the history and the script of mass shootings that indicate that as a general rule, these guys broadcast their intentions. And so what is a red flag law is directly aimed at that script. It's directly aimed at that history. And so unlike some other popular means of gun control, which have not been proven to have any effect on mass shootings, this is one that is aimed directly at the evidence of how these guys operate. Now, we don't know that it will work. The Rand Corporation study of studies basically says we don't have a sufficient study of the effect of red flag laws, and the answer for that's pretty obvious. They're really new. So to know whether they're going to work will require a lot more study. Whereas we've had a lot of experience with assault weapons bans. We've had a lot of experience with magazine capacity restrictions, with expanded background checks, with waiting periods. We've had a lot of experience with that. We have not had experience with red flag laws, but their advantage is they're aimed at behavior, and they're aimed at the actual problem, that what the evidence indicates that the actual problem, what the evidence indicates are patterns and habits related to the actual problem. So that's why I've been sort of, Jonah Goldberg, my colleague, says that I'm doing everything but walking up and down the street in a sandwich board saying enact red flag laws.
Well, here's my last turn at my soapbox on this, which is it strikes me that when you're talking about that gun fetish movement, which is growing in ascendancy in political power and hold over the debate, because it represents kind of, like you said, the most activated base of the Republican Party. It seems to me another word for a fetish is idolatry. That we have elevated something to its highest, almost sacred status, that it can't be touched, and that it can't be challenged anyway, even if it frankly demands sacrifice of lives. To me, that gun fetish, I see the markers of gun idolatry all over again. Now, the interesting thing about how do you respond to the presence of idolatry? I mean, there is a way of responding to it, which is to confront it head on and try to topple it head on. and go after it. There's a biblical sort of model for that, but not always. And frankly, in our context, there's a sense in which you can also say that when another way you give power to an idol is by calling focusing all attention on it. Like when you focus a thing and say everything has to do with that, and in one case, whether one side is saying we must uphold it, the opposing view that says the answer is we must topple it, in some ways you're giving kind of preeminence and power and attention to that thing. And so that's why I'm actually more open to the idea that even though I still believe in limiting access to the thing itself, to the gun itself, I'm actually interested, I'm curious that maybe there's a way to respond to gun idolatry by actually taking attention away from the object itself. But like you said, I'm trying to get underneath of the behavior, going underneath the sort of human realities that are driving people to, in my overheated rhetoric, to actually bow down to that gun fetish, to bow down at that gun idolatry. And the one thing I'm really thinking about is, well, what's really driving a lot of this behavior of this sort of bowing down to the gun as the answer here is really anxiety and despair, right? So anxiety and despair, certainly despair in terms of when you look at the profile of the disaffected young males engaged in most of the mass shootings, these are lives of despair, right, that have been driven to this point. And so can we actually as Christians try to speak to the underlying forces and sort of cultural influences that are leading our young men to that place of despair? And anxiety. I mean, anxiety is actually the main emotional driver for people to have the need for guns. I mean, the number one cited reason is self-defense, as people are feeling insecure. It's the reason why in times of crisis, in the pandemic, anytime there's a major, even after January 6th, after George Floyd, gun ownership actually in gun purchases go up. And the reason is because people are feeling scared. They're feeling insecure, right? And so, I think, David, I'm writing a book on anxiety, and part of the reason for that is I just see anxiety as a huge driver over so many of our public policy issues. And we're debating public policy issues thinking the state or some policy out there can just solve it. And we're not addressing sort of this underlying emotional driver of anxiety and giving people a different way to deal with their anxiety rather than seeking the solution in something like guns. And we know that anxiety is the presence of anxiety is the biggest predictor for the presence of depression and despair, which in both turns are actually the biggest driver in the largest deaths from shootings, which is suicide, using guns in suicides. And similarly, it's the anxiety that is spawning in our public discourse that causes us to not be able to even consider common sense experiments like the red flag laws, right? Because you have on this side of the pro-gun side this anxiety that any little movement towards gun control spawns this anxiety of they're out to come to get us. That this is just the first step in us, and then taking away our guns and so forth. So my sense, my sort of desire, if you're pounding the drum on red flag laws, I'm trying to pound the drum on anxiety, that we need to actually mobilize our communities, our churches, to deal with this underlying epidemic of anxiety that's actually infecting all sorts of dysfunctional, dangerous behaviors, including guns. So what do you think about that, David?
Well, I think the idolatry point is really key here. And we talked earlier or last week about idols demand a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that's what is so deeply alarming to me about the gun fetish movement, is that there is a gun idolatry. I do think the gun idolatry leads to behavior that is reckless and dangerous. One of those behaviors, for example, is the increased prevalence of open-carried rifles at protests. I think that this is, I think this, as I've written, it escalates the menace and the threat and the danger and the likelihood of violence in public. So I think that there is an absolute need for responsible gun owners to push back against this gun fetishism, precisely because it does smack of idolatry. If you're putting in a ad, God and guns are in the same lineup, right?
With babies.
With babies. And then much less guns and Trump in the same lineup with God. Yeah. I mean, like there's that you're radiating, there's a problem there. And then what that idolatry then leads to is you're closed right. to information. You're closed to argument. Look, there's a lot of people who are open to red flag laws, and then they get closed really fast when the gun fetish world moves strongly against it. Now, interestingly, you go back to 2018, Trump was for red flag laws for a hot minute. So was the NRA for a hot minute. And then, there was a backlash against it. And so, I think that idolatry point is one that is incredibly important to make. And that's what's disturbing to me. The very first piece I wrote in The Atlantic was in 2018. I wrote a piece explaining American gun culture. And I will tell you, American gun culture is different 4 years later than it was in 2018.
Yeah.
It is different. And it is much more moved in that fetish direction than what I recognized growing up. And I find that deeply disturbing. And here, and this is why you have to be open. There are two policies that really had a big, there were two policies that were deemed to have a big effect, on deaths and unintentional deaths and suicide, or on gun deaths. Okay, that had a pretty big measurable effect. Child access prevention laws had a big measurable effect on unintentional injuries and deaths and suicide. Stand your ground laws now seem to have a pretty big effect on the increase of that they may increase violent crime. There's pretty strong evidence that stand your ground laws increase violent crime.
So, David, just explain just quickly explain what is a stand your ground law?
What a stand your ground law
lead to more? Why do those laws actually lead to more gun violence?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question as to why they lead to more violence. But in theory, it's not hard to explain. So essentially what a stand your ground law says is that if you're in a confrontation, in an aggressive confrontation, you have no duty to retreat. Now, there used to be a relatively common common law requirement that if you're in a deadly circumstance, that you have a duty to retreat, and you can only use deadly force to defend yourself if you had no reasonable opportunity to retreat. So stand your ground law says that if you are not the aggressor, you have no duty to retreat. And so that means that you don't have to leave the scene, even if leaving the scene is open to you. Now, you can imagine why that would increase deadly encounters in the streets. Not quite sure why it increases violent crime, but there seems to be a causative effect there. And people who are Second Amendment supporters should be open to understanding that evidence and responding accordingly. And there's nothing that says that my ability to defend myself trumps the obligation to even preserve the life of my attacker if I have the ability to retreat.
Right. So I want to just try to draw us to a concluding note around this theme of challenging gun idolatry, because it strikes me that, in the biblical model, there is some challenge that can come from the outside and must come from outside of the culture that's in, so you have, for instance, the prophets critiquing the idolatry of the nations happening in Babylon and Syria. They're not Babylonians, they're not part of the Assyrian culture. They're outsiders looking from the outside in. that would be like me challenging gun idolatry in the gun culture, right? You can do it. It's probably necessary at some level. Is it really going to actually change the behavior of Babylonians and Syrians? Probably not. Then you also have the model of prophets in exile who are now they've been sent into exile. They're now part of the Babylonian or Assyrian culture. And almost kind of from the inside, they're more speaking to the idolatry. Or the other example would be Israel, probably more relevant example, Israel's prophets speaking about Israel's own idolatry as Israelites and saying, look, this is not part of the true Israel culture, this idolatry you're practicing. That's probably the better analogy here. And so it strikes me that, David, frankly, you're much more of the key prophetic voice here against gun idolatry than some Chinese American living in progressive San Jose is going to be. But the key would be then for people like me and people like you not to be pitted in a us versus them camp, but to be able to make a common cause in calling for repentance against gun idolatry. And this is where we're going to need to be able to embrace some complexity in order to say, okay, where is the real common sort of threat, true spiritual threat here that we can agree on, and be able to, because otherwise we're actually on the same side on that front, whereas we may be on different if we sort of fall into the simplistic definitions provided by the current debate. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a constant, and this is something that I think there's a constant here, and the constant is that critique is always most effective when it's internal critique, and it's always most enraging when it's internal critique because it is most effective. So,
right.
A person who is within the evangelical church has standing to be heard within the evangelical church if there's a problem in the church. People tune out someone say, there's this New York Times editorialized against Southern Baptist Convention.
Right.
But here's a Baptist who says we've got a problem. Now, that because of the effectiveness of the critique, that also often leaves the person who makes the critique open to extraordinary backlash because you risk being seen as the traitor, right?
Yeah.
And so and the backlash is extraordinary because the critique can be effective.
Right.
And which makes it hard to mount.
Well, and it seems like, and that's all sides need to be willing, all people of good faith on all sides need to be willing to take on some of that load of internal critique, right? So it strikes me, one of perhaps my callings in this issue is to speak to my progressive friends and to explain to them kind of responsible gun culture and the actual importance of guns properly for this way of life and culture that we may not understand, but we at least have to make some effort to understand the complexity and the cultural reality on the other side, while making important distinctions that we've been trying to make here. So this isn't just something that like, hey, gun owners, you need to be calling to task your fellow community members who have fallen into gun idolatry. In the same way, I need to do that with my own side, such that we're not overly simplifying things here and overly demonizing the other side.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And once we recognize complexity, introduces humility. In my experience, the understanding of complexity introduces humility, and sometimes it takes a long time for people to understand complexity. I have seen in my lifetime debates over the Middle East evolve. 20 years ago, people knew how to handle, peace in the Middle East, and you're an idiot if you disagreed.
Right.
And 20 years later, there's a lot of humility in approaching these kinds of issues. And not everywhere, of course, not everywhere, but a lot more than I saw 20, 25 years ago. And that is not the case right now in the argument over gun violence. In spite of a lot of experience with complexity, it's still not the case, in part because it's so thoroughly caught up in the red-blue divide, and which inhibits and disincentivizes any kind of complex treatment of an issue.
And compromise, which is the only way this is going to. This is
Right.
It's the only way we're going to get anything done here. Neither side is going to actually wield enough cultural or political power to enforce our will on the other here.
Yeah. Well, okay, man. This might have been our wonkiest.
Yeah,
Our
it was a lot of wonk.
podcast. A lot of wonkery in here, but you know what? It's important. It's important because there's a lot of agreement on core values. We want to defend innocent life and protect innocent life, and a lot of confusion on how to get there. So it's going to get wonky. It absolutely is. So anyway, whew, okay, I'm tired after that one. Please rate us if you have not rated us yet on wherever you get your podcasts. Especially on Apple Podcasts. I'd really appreciate it if you guys would give us some good reviews, please, on Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Check out Curtis's work at redeemingbabel.org, my work at thedispatch.com, and we'll be back next Saturday.